Hello everyone, Wrestling Fan here. So recently, Jacques Rougeau, formerly known as playing the wrestling character The Mountie, and being part of the tag team The Rougeau Brothers during the golden era of WWE/WWF television, was on stories with Briscoe and Bradshaw. And one of the things he mentioned was that in his opinion, Jimmy Hart was the greatest manager of all time. Now, this does bring up an interesting discussion within the wrestling fandom. The greatest manager of all time, the GOAT of managers. I would argue that 5 years ago or so, that answer was always Bobby the Brain Heenan, and rightfully so. It's the Brain, the Weasel. Bobby the Brain Heenan would be number one. Oftentimes, Jim Cornette would be considered number two, and it would branch off from there. Maybe it was J.J. Dillon number three, Gary Hart, Jimmy Hart, Sherry Martel. The list goes on and on, right? And that leads to an interesting discussion today because 5 years later, I think in a lot of people's eyes, maybe it's recency bias, but Paul Heyman, I think, has, in some people's eyes, replaced Bobby the Brain Heenan as number one. Not in my opinion. I still think Bobby has that spot. But on the topic of Jimmy Hart, it does lead to an interesting discussion. Jimmy Hart might be the most underrated manager of all time. I think because of just the year we're in, 2024, when you think Jimmy Hart, you think late 80s WWF, early 90s WWF, and you think of his mid-90s WCW run. But when you do a deep dive into Jimmy Hart's career, he played such a very important role in Memphis. Working with the legendary Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Hart, he was a key central figure down there in Memphis as a manager. And so when you really look at wrestling history, I don't know if Jimmy Hart is the greatest manager of all time, but if we do a list of most underrated managers of all time, even underrated wrestling figures, underrated wrestling personalities, I would put Jimmy Hart on that list, definitely. I don't know if he's the GOAT manager. That is such a subjective argument. That is such a subjective topic in general. For me, it's always going to be Bobby the Brain Heenan. But I understand people putting Jimmy Hart in that position. He was very entertaining. And as I said, played such a key role in Memphis for many years. So he's definitely on that underrated list, in my opinion. But that's all for this one, guys. Wrestling Fan out.